Everybody needs to understand that I'm more than simply a hype man for this rap group, just like Geico is more than just a company that can save you money. Geico also has fast and friendly claim service, so they can help you when you need it most. And while I do love being a hype man, I also love reading for children's audiobooks. Like Little Bo Peep, she lost a sheep, and she don't know where to find them. Yo!
Geico. Expect great savings and a whole lot more.
Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Within the Chaos with your host,
Rodney Shortridge,
and co-host,
Robin Dalton.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us again tonight. You can listen by going to blogtalkradio.com/Within the Chaos, or call in or listen in to ask any questions to our guest at 323-870-4197. From deep within the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for listening to Within the Chaos. My name is Rodney Shortridge, and I'll be your host tonight, along with my fiery redhead co-host, Robin Dalton.
Hey, y'all.
Tonight, our special guest is Bishop Bryan Ouellette. Bishop Ouellette is a semi-retired Eastern Orthodox Western Catholic bishop and exorcist of the Old Roman Catholic Sacred Order of St. Michael the Archangel Order of Exorcists. He's been on the show a couple months ago, and we're excited to have him back again tonight. So, Robin, how was your week?
Busy as usual. That's about it. It's been very uneventful. Just getting ready for a new schedule change at work and getting ready to get started on some Black Diamond stuff. Other than that, pretty uneventful.
I have worked my bunghole off all week. I was up all night last night working on questions and stuff, not only for Bryan, but also another Bryan that he'll be on later. Let's see, in February. There's a lot of Bryans and Steves that we've got coming up. It's weird. But I guess I'll go ahead and we'll go ahead and introduce Bryan and get him on here. It's my honor to welcome back to our show our special guest, Bishop Bryan Ouellette. Hello, Bishop, and thank you for joining us tonight. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me back. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Oh, tonight's going to be interesting because I know when we left off the last time, there's a lot of questions I wanted to ask about religion and God and so forth. And I talked to some of my friends and the ones that listen to the show, and they also sent us a bunch of questions to ask. So we're going to be it's a lot of questions, but we'll do what we can do within the 2 hours we're allotted.
We'll do our best. I'm sure we can get through a lot of them.
Heck yeah. Well, I guess we'll just sum it up again. Tell us a little bit about yourself before we start getting into all these good questions.
Well, sure. I am the presiding bishop of the Holy Nicolean Catholic Church, which is a autocephalous, independent Catholic tradition that is separate from the Vatican. We are not under the canons of the Vatican. We are not associated with Roman Catholicism, although we're virtually indistinguishable from it, with just some minor differences, but nothing that would be dramatic outside of the fact that we're not bound by the canons of Rome, which gives us some freedom. And that's good because our primary outreach is the Order of Exorcists. We have an affiliation with the old Roman Catholic Church and the Order of Exorcists. And so that is our primary work in the Nicolean tradition, which is to investigate claims of demonic attack and possession and to assist people who are in spiritual crisis. And so not having the red tape of the bureaucracy of the Vatican gives us a lot of freedom to be able to expedite help to these individuals who would otherwise not be eligible to receive it. So that's the majority of our work. We also run a teaching ministry that sort of deals with Christian esotericism as well. So we have a philosophical side, a very deep philosophical side, when we're not working on the resolving the paranormal.
Okay, I hope you're ready for these questions because, like I said, this is completely, it's nothing to do. I don't think, from all the questions about the exorcism, because if anybody wants to know anything about what he does, when we talked about the exorcisms he's performed and so forth, just go to blogtalkradio.com within the chaos. And it was in November he was last on, and you can listen about that. So the first question it's kind of a three-part question. It goes, what is the purpose of humans on earth in God's eyes? Why create a human to have it worship you? And isn't it egotistical of God to create humans to just have them worship him?
Okay, that's a good question. It's something that we get a lot from agnostics and atheists, and it's a question I hear often. And part of the answer, or I should say part of the question, is the result of a misunderstanding of the theology of the church. And that is, it's not, I don't like getting into purpose, because purpose is a largely human need that God does not possess. So the first problem that we must solve before we can even begin to answer this three-part question is to understand that purpose is an invention of the human mind. It is not something that is intrinsic to the divine nature. Our relationship to the divine nature can sometimes give us a feeling of purpose, and that's where we tend to put a lot of effort towards those things that give us meaning. But there is a vast difference between function and purpose. And God operates from the stand of function. He doesn't have to have a reason for doing anything. He simply does, and that's it. And then there's various functions and processes that are at work that become part of the overall system of creation that is, part of our reality as well, but certainly not limited to just our experiential reality. But because we tend to be ego-driven creatures, and we're always operating on the basis of cause and effect, we have an obsession with meaning. And because that obsession with meaning is so pervasive, we tend to attach purpose or look for purpose or create purpose, even if we have to invent spiritualities that, even if they're wrong, that give us a greater sense of meaning. Because if you look at the overall life and death cycle, in a universe that's billions of years old, a lifetime of 60, 70, 80, maybe 90 or 100 years if you're lucky, seems rather insignificant. And it is. Cosmically speaking, every human life is cosmically insignificant. But that does not mean it does not possess intrinsic functions that make it exceptionally important. And so therefore, while on a cosmic scale, there is nothing remarkable about human existence, on a divine scale, it is extremely important. So it's always from which side of the coin that you're looking at that we must understand in order to answer these types of deep philosophical questions. So now understanding it that way, understanding that the first problem here is attaching purpose to the activity of God, which is always going to come up short. And it's also part of the problem with understanding this. Understanding that is going to help us to move beyond it so that we can sort of break that paradigm and then maybe get a little glimpse of what's actually going on there. So the purpose of creating humanity is essentially at the highest esoteric and mystical and metaphysical level is so that we can, or I should say that creation can, a vehicle through which it can self-observe. And that's, if you really want to break the meaning of life down to a rather unemotional purpose, and like I said, I don't really like that word because it has too much ego reality attached to it, and it puts more into it than would ordinarily be there. That would be the best answer for the meaning of human life, because what we are allowed to do is what we are essentially are vehicles of observation. Now, we get lost in our observations, of course, and then we start to build little fictions around our life that give us a certain sense of reality and cohesion to that reality so that there's consistency and it seems to make sense. And that's part of the reason why we are always looking for meaning and purpose, is because largely the cosmos does not make sense to a limited, linear being like a human being is. And so in order to feel safe, which is one of our survival instincts, one of the essential qualities to a healthy mind is feeling safe. Because if you don't feel safe, then you're going to have all sorts of anxiety complexes that are going to eventually degrade your functioning and limit your survival, shorten your life. Because we know, without any shadow of a doubt, anxiety and depression and various other types of neuroses will shorten our lifespan, will lend us to greater levels of disease. And so it is not conducive to survival to not feel safe. And so we have a built-in instinct. Part of our survival instinct is to derive meaning from the things that we do. And so part of that is understanding our place within the cosmos, which can seem completely pointless and almost inconceivable when you really break it down, because unless one is operating at a very higher mystical level where some of these paradigms have already been broken, which makes it easier to ex God in a more direct and deliberate way, we're going to have a great deal of limitation getting beyond those preconceptions. And so the first answer to the answer to the first part of that question is the purpose of humanity is to create a vehicle for self-observation, which would otherwise not exist. Now, the Bible alludes to this metaphorically by giving the reason that God created man because God was lonely. And so in order to no longer sort of be alone, he created us so that he could enter into a relationship and companionship with us. Now, that's just a metaphor. God does not get lonely. God does not possess human deficits like loneliness. It would not be something that would be even compatible vibrationally with what we would understand to be God. So this is, again, a human problem and trying to understand a divine issue from the limitations of a human problem. And so that's the first answer to the question. Now, the second part being why create beings to worship him? Well, now let's get into the traditional theology of the church, because that perhaps answers it better than I could on a physical level. And that is very simple. God does not require our worship. He did not create us so that he could have an army of people worshiping him. That is not at all the intent behind creation. Again, going back to the faculties of observation, which are intrinsic to the overall end game of the universe, or the cosmos in general, which includes more than just this universe, I should say. But that's another, that's perhaps another subject altogether. Is from that vantage point, understanding that what we are here to do involves intimacy and relationship, which is why human existence and survival is governed by sexual instinct as well. And so that sexual instinct not only gives us the ability to procreate and thus create the continuation of our species, but it also involves intimate relationship, so that not only do we get to produce new life, but we get to more fully experience each other's lives through that relational encounter. Now, sexuality, of course, is the highest expression of that human beings can engage in, as far as, at least with each other, because that is literally a sharing of each other's physicality. And that's not something that we just do with anybody, although there are some people out there that probably do. But, for most of us, we're kind of selective about who we decide to engage in with that type of intimacy. But what God is doing is engaging in an intimacy with us that goes far beyond anything that human sexuality could even begin to replicate. It's just a crude shadow, a crude example of intimacy when one understands the type of intimacy in which God is engaging with us. And so that explains why when we're looking at like the books of the Old Testament, like the Song of Songs, which is a very sexualized metaphor for the relationship between how God feels about humanity. It's not just this father-son type of relationship, which is the more socially accepted paradigm of the Christian religion, but it's actually more in line with a bride and bridegroom. And so this is why the church uses this metaphorical language when it refers to Christ as the bridegroom and refers to the church, which is us, as his bride. That's not an accidental metaphor. That's not just nice flowery language. It's because he wants to enter into an intimacy that would only be appropriate to a marriage. But because we don't have any human institutions that go beyond the sexual encounter, that's the best metaphor we have in the human realm for understanding this type of intimacy. So the purpose of worship does nothing for God's sake. It's all about us being able to raise ourselves up to a higher state of being so that we can make ourselves compatible with the divine reality. Nothing man can do can add an ounce of greatness to God. Nothing. And that's what the church has always taught. It's never been, even in Jewish times, in ancient Judaism, it was the same story then as well. We cannot add to God's greatness. So he doesn't require our worship. The reason he requests our worship is because our acts of worship help to raise us up so that we can operate with God at a level that is closer to his vibrational existence, for lack of a better terminology. I like to use the word vibration, even though it sounds a little new agey. I like to use it because it helps to try to understand that, vibrationally, things are not compatible. Not all things are equal. In fact, this entire cosmos is built on the very function of inequality. In fact, the entire economy of the cosmos depends upon inequality. And the reason for that is because there must always be a careful balance of allocation. And so just like in human economy, if I have $1, that's one less dollar that everyone else can have, because I possess the rights to that dollar, and I control what happens with that dollar. And if I have more of those dollars, then that gives me more control that takes away from everyone else. And it has to be that way. It has to be that way. Because if you don't have equality, then you can't have balance. That's deep, esoteric, philosophical conversation that might extend outside of the range of the answer to this question. But what I'm essentially getting at is we are not vibrationally compatible with the divine reality that we call God. And that's what makes God distant, at least in our perception of it. That's what makes God mysterious to us. That's what makes God so difficult to grasp that it's much easier sometimes for some people, particularly typically oriented people like myself, it's very difficult to even accept the existence of God, because it's easier to rationalize it away in terms of wishful thinking or, superstition or some of the other explanations that are given from very left-brain scientific thinkers that would, try to write God off as just a human invention that fulfills a certain role within a primitive society that is, in their minds, no longer applicable today. But the reason God seems so difficult to understand, so distant, so non-existent to us, is because we're not vibrationally compatible. And so, therefore, we can only experience largely things that are vibrationally compatible with our own nature. And that issue is further compounded by the fact that we have 5 senses. That limits us to only the things that those 5 senses can detect. So unless something is physical enough to be seen, to be heard, to be tasted, to be touched, we're not, or to be smelled, we're not able to necessarily experience it in any tangible way. Now, we have many other types of senses that most people have never developed. And this is where you get into some of where these concepts of psychic ability come from, mediumship, and that type of thing. And that's because they're less tangible, and those senses are more attuned to higher vibrational realities that are not compatible with our own physicality. And that creates a conflict in people's minds, which instinctively would say, oh, well, then it's not real. And so therefore we have this idea in this world, in our world today, particularly our very scientific post-Renaissance world, that, or I should say even postmodern world today now, because that's even gone further, what that leaves us with is this idea that if you can't use your five senses to experience it and replicate it multiple times, it isn't true. And unfortunately, that leaves out the entire non-corporeality of the universe, which is the majority of it, because most of the universe is non-corporeal. Most of the universe is a culmination of energy systems that the human system is not even able to perceive. And the divine reality, of course, encompasses all of it. So worship, which is done in the form of liturgy, prayer, meditation, all sorts of various, I should say, methods of the church or tools of the church, allow us to bring ourselves closer to God. It's not for when we say it's for God's glory, it's not because God needs glory. It's because we are not able to experience his reality unless we do something dramatically different to change our vibrational rate so that our reality changes. And so what you're going to see in people that very much persist in atheism and agnosticism, which I can sympathize with, believe me, I've struggled with those in previous years of studying philosophy, and so I get it. I can't emphasize this enough. I'm a very scientific type of thinker, and so I struggled with this. So I'm very, very understanding of the proclivity to see things through the lens of an atheist or agnostic viewpoint. But what I did not know at the time that I now know now, that I understand now, is that until we make the effort, which is that leap of faith that you hear Christians talking about, again, faith is not about blind trust. Faith is about directing your awareness towards things that are not necessarily self-evident. And until we make a great effort to do this, which worship, if you really break it down on a scientific, psychological basis, that's exactly what it's doing. That's exactly why it does what it does. Then you'll never experience those higher realities of God. You'll never get to the point where you can observe God because you're not cultivating those levels of perception that are necessary in order to experience that reality. So it'll always be closed to you, and you'll never have that direct experience. And the direct experience is necessary in order to understand the basis for this question, which is one of the most ultimate questions for theologians and philosophers, I think. I know there was a third part of that. I don't know if I answered it. What was the third part there, Rodney?
Isn't it egotistical of God to create humans to just have them worship him?
I think we kind of did answer that because it isn't about worshiping him. It's about entering into relationship with us. You know, Orthodoxy has this Eastern Orthodoxy has this wonderful theological adage that I use often, and anyone who knows me probably hears me say this more times than they want to count. God became man so that man could become God. So if you really want to understand the nature of God's love for us, it is absolutely purely selfless. There's nothing egotistical about it because it is just the creation as it exists the intention behind the creation that exists, I should say, was about sharing his reality in that. So it's actually and the most that it could be, because it's not about worshiping him, it's about making it possible for us to become part of his reality so that we're no longer limited to this human existence. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what about, like, some of the things that they expect from us, that God expects from us, like judgment? Say, I know I can stop someone from molesting a young child, but I don't. How would I be judged by God?
Well, judgment's a difficult thing because, again, like all of these very complicated concepts, like faith, like purpose, are always seen through the lens of the human mind, which is limited and not compatible with the divine reality as we've already established. So the same thing goes when we're talking about judgment, because God, again, we use metaphors, and the metaphor is going to always be representative of something that we can understand. So in our human reality, what we have is the mores of society that every person is obligated to follow, or there are penalties involved if we don't. And so we establish as a civilization what's acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable behavior. And then as civilization becomes more complex, we will then determine what is legal and what is not legal, and then create sanctions for illegal behavior. And in order to be able to ascertain whether or not somebody deserves that type of punishment, a certain judgment must be enacted. So, a case is brought to trial, it's evaluated by a judge and jury, and then a judgment is passed that is compatible, or I should say is appropriate to the crime that was committed, hopefully. In a perfect world, that's the way it works. Doesn't always work out that way. But, that's the idealization of our justice system. And that's all we've got to work with as human beings. We don't have anything higher than that that we are able to understand. And so, therefore, again, the Bible, which is written by man for men, inspired by God, but still written by men for men as faith accounts, not histories, not definitive, all-inclusive statements about the divine reality. In fact, the Bible only contains those spiritual truths that are necessary for salvation and doesn't contain a word more than that. And so, you get sometimes people who are like, well, if it's not in the Bible, then it's not true. Well, I hate to say it, but again, the Bible doesn't contain everything that there is to know about God. It can't. It's not possible to put that into a book. But what it does contain is what human beings need to know about salvation. And that's a very limited, very small part of the divine reality. It's really the only part that's sort of reserved for us, but does not, again, have any real reflection on the divine reality that can exist just fine without us. It doesn't need us to exist. Just like it doesn't need us to worship God. The divine reality is a completely separate thing that we have been welcomed into. But we use judgment as an archetype for understanding how God decides, again, a human concept, who is worthy of salvation and who is not. Now, that's the way we have to look at it, because we don't have the capacity to understand the actual process. So we have a metaphor. And unfortunately, people start to, over the centuries, start to believe the metaphors and take them literally. And then before you know it, God is little more than just a guy up there with his gavel, issuing out judgments. That's not the way it works at all. In fact, God, if anything, exhibits absolute, perfect, unconditional compassion. And judgment is not really part of that equation. So to understand, like your example, you said somebody's hurting a child, you're able to stop it, but you choose not to. Well, there is a certain culpability there, but in a sense, you inflict the judgment upon yourself, which is always congruent to your capacity to understand the situation. And that's where culpability comes in. And so you are never judged unfairly by the system, But it isn't so much God judging you as it is you issuing out the judgment and punishment for yourself based upon the choices that you make. If you know that you are not making the best choices for your life and you persist in doing those errors anyway, then the consequences will be self-evident. You won't need God to issue out any problems or punishments for your life because you're going to sufficiently screw it up yourself doing it that way. But if you are doing the best that you can with the intellect that you were given, which not everyone has a sufficient intellect to live the best, most moral, ethical life possible. In fact, the most ethical people are typically higher functioning because they're able to consider multiple avenues. And then, ironically, some of the least ethical people are also the highest functioning because sometimes they just don't think that the rules apply to them. And again, that all gets factored into the overall component of that person's reality, which will, over time, define who they are. And so the judgment that we hear about in the Bible is not God weighing your good deeds and your bad deeds as much as it is the consequences of what you have created and generated is going to be self-evident over time in the course of the pattern that you have created and put into effect into the cosmos itself. We all effectuate patterns. We are essentially a vibrational pattern, and as we interact with the world, we change the patterns around us. And so if we're putting out, I don't like using the words good and bad because that at an absolute level is not entirely accurate. What is more accurate would be the language of wholesome actions versus unwholesome actions, or even better yet, skillful actions versus unskillful actions. So sometimes we make unskillful choices, and those consequences will effectuate into affecting other people as well as ourselves. And sometimes we are skillful, in which case it's a benefit to ourselves and the people around us. The end result, though, is how much did you cultivate your faculties of awareness to the point that you could raise yourself enough to be able to be compatible with the kingdom of heaven. So when we look at the Christian worldview and understand what it takes to gain salvation, we know, number one, from the Christian worldview, for those who are Christian, and I know this doesn't, this is not something that's going to always resonate with people who are not Christian. But from the Christian point of view, when we're thinking about things like judgment, what we have to understand is, number one, salvation was attained by the action of the cross. And now you might get some people that say, what kind of egotistical God would send his son to sacrifice himself in this bloody, disgusting execution just so that he can have atonement for our sins? Why does God need that? Okay, yeah, I hear that all the time too. That's kind of along the lines of the first question you gave me. And the answer to that, again, is about understanding the metaphysical reversal of the process. We exist in entropy, which means we are spawned into existence through conception and birth and then live out our lives through a slow dying process to eventually lose out to death. That's the normal, natural way of things. Christ comes into the picture at a theological level, somewhat metaphorical and somewhat historical. There's a careful balance between those two realities within the Christian message, and they're both essential to it. What Christ does is, through the dying process, is able to reverse entropy and then lead us into what I call an ectropic reality, where things go from death back into life and then perpetual life. Whereas at the current state of entropy, things go into a perpetual state of decay until there's no energy left, that the end result of an entropic universe is cold death. Eventually, the universe will literally burn itself out to the point where there will be nothing existent because there will be no energy left within it in order to continue to do what the universe does by virtue of existing. But an extropic reality would be the opposite. And so now get back to your question about judgment, okay? What judgment is whether or not we have cultivated enough of the divine life to be compatible with heaven. So God sends no one to hell. We send ourselves there by virtue of not cultivating our spiritual condition in order to make it compatible enough. So Christ opens the door. You could say that the salvation on the cross, the death on the cross in the Christian worldview, opens the door to salvation, whereas before it was closed. And before, there was nothing we could do to get into the kingdom of heaven. It was completely closed off to us because our reality was just too great a chasm of incompatibility. Christ comes down by taking on human nature, makes the divine reality compatible with ours. That's what is so important about the incarnation. We just had Christmas. Well, now you know the true meaning of Christmas. It has nothing to do with gifts. It really doesn't have anything to do with Santa Claus. And it really doesn't even have anything to do with the birth of the Savior. What it has to do with is the fact that God becomes man. That's the incarnation. That's what the nativity story is really all about. And what that does is for the first time, we get to experience, our nature gets to experience the divine nature, which now unlocks the potential that is built within us to become divine creatures, to literally become gods ourselves. And so the only way to enter into that reality is to raise ourselves to the point where we are now compatible. The Eastern Orthodox call that process theosis. And that is what true salvation is. So the judgment is not so much you weren't good enough, so I'm going to send you to the hell. The judgment is you didn't do the work, and so therefore it's not going to work for you. Salvation is still in our hands. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So, salvation is in our hands. It's not, God, Christ makes it possible for us, but we still have to work it out. We still have to work out our salvation. It's not an automatic condition. It's not something that we say, oh, Jesus, I believe in you. Thank you for dying for me and my sins. Now I'm good to go. It doesn't work like that. And it never worked like that. It didn't work like that until modern Christianity, where, there was such deviations from the original theology that, people started coming up with all sorts of very watered down understandings of the gospel. But it's always been about working your salvation out. You use the tools that Jesus gives us, but we have to actually use the tools. It's not as simple as, I like this. Let me leave you with this one, and we'll get on to the next question. I like this analogy. It's kind of like Jesus. Okay, let me put it this way. If I gave you all of the components of an automobile, all of the components, every screw, every little part, unassembled, would you, without any knowledge about how to build a car, be able to put it together so that you could drive to Florida? Let's say you're here with me in Georgia, and you want to drive to Disneyland, and we'll say Disneyland is heaven, okay? And we're here in the problems of Earth right here in Atlanta, and we want to get in our car and drive to Disney World, but we don't have a car. So Jesus comes by and says, "Here's all the equipment you need. So go build yourself a car and get there." Would you be able to do it? I mean, unless you're an engineer, probably not. Even having all the tools there, you probably could not put that thing together to a point that it would actually operate. So the dying on the cross, what that does is, it's almost like Jesus saying, not only am I going to give you the tools, but I'm going to assemble the car for you. But I'm not driving you there. You're going to have to get into that car. You're going to have to learn how to drive it. You're going to have to get your license, and then you're going to have to figure out how to safely drive down there. And then when you get there, I'll be there waiting for you, and I'll let you into the gates. That's what salvation is. That's sort of an analogy for it.
Well, I guess next question. If God created everything, did he create evil?
Indirectly, you could say, okay, I'm gonna make this. I'm gonna have to answer this by sort of reversing the question. Evil is not created. Evil is the absence of what is created. The problem of evil is the fact that the universe, the cosmos itself, has two operational principles that keep it into existence. There is creation and there is destruction. Neither one of them is good. Neither one of them is evil. It is just by the destructive process we are able to regenerate and create new creation. So everything that's created has to come from, first, the energy of that which is first destroyed. And everything that is destroyed has to first be created. So that's the paradox of the system of creation. The Chinese Taoists would understand this to be the process of yin and yang. So when you see that Tai Chi 2 symbol, that sort of like you see it on like martial arts and the yin yang symbol, that is what that's representative of. It's representative of the process of creation, which is spawning into existence. And by spawning into existence, it's taking the energy of what was destroyed before it, and the energy of what's created is eventually taken, absorbed, and destroyed so that it can create itself anew. And so this is the birth rebirth process that you hear about in reincarnation in Eastern religion, and that's because Eastern philosophy has always understood this, whereas Western linear philosophy hasn't always been able to get there because they like to see absolute origins and absolute endings, and there are none, unfortunately. So to answer that question, we have to first understand that process of creation and destruction is how everything in the universe maintains its balance. And that is why we must have death, not an option. Because if you don't have death, you will offset the balance of creation, and eventually it will wipe itself out. The destructive principle will actually overcome it and destroy creation as we know it, and vice versa. If the creative faculty were to become the only operational component of the universe, then it would actually end up wiping out destruction, which is destruction in and of itself. And once again, the balance is restored. So it always works itself out, regardless of how imbalanced it gets. But it can cause a lot of havoc for us when it is unbalanced. So to understand whether or not God created evil, we have to first understand that by virtue of the way creation works, evil is going to be a necessary function of the process by virtue of human interpretation. So, cosmically speaking, there is no good, there is no evil. There is only function. That is what the universe ultimately is. It's a system of functioning. And it creates and it destroys. It creates and it destroys. And we kind of getting there with theoretical physics because some of these physicists are really bright, brilliant people, and they're starting to understand that the nature of a black hole is such that some theories are suggesting that all that energy that gets absorbed into a black hole is actually being spewed out on the other side in some different reality that is called a white hole. And all that energy is being recycled out. So some theoretical physicists now are starting to surmise that the Big Bang essentially is the other end of a black hole of another universe, where all that energy got sucked in and spewed out, and we're the result of it spewing forth. And there's definitely some good metaphysical, mystical observations that have been made that would substantiate that science. And so I'm very interested in where theoretical physics goes, because they're starting to really bridge that gap between science and religion in a way that no other type of science can. But the problem with that is human interpretation, because we are not experiencing cosmic reality. We experience the stories of our lives, and we build all sorts of clever stories, and our mores and conditioning will determine how we perceive the universe. So therefore, the things that happen that we don't like, we immediately write off and say, oh, that's evil. And the things that we do like, we'll say, oh, this is great, this is goodness, this is a miracle, this is from God. But the thing is, it's understanding how that system of perception influences us and actually, unfortunately, causes us to miss the point. And what is really happening here is that in the process of the destructive principle of the universe, which is necessary, are certain principles that are at work that are destructive by nature. We are not compatible with that reality as human beings. Now you might say, but wait a second, human beings are very destructive, but not by nature. Our nature is actually to procreate, which is why our survival instinct is not self-destruction, and our survival instinct is to reproduce, and that's why we call our process of reproduction procreation, because it is literally the instrument of creation itself, and it's sort of, an archetypal assignment that's built into our very language, so that we always understand ourselves within the process of creation. We like to build things. We like to build our civilization. We didn't learn that invent the wheel and then just didn't do anything with it. What did we turn the wheel into? We turned it into marvelous tools. We got spaceships now. And so our civilization's getting more and more and more advanced because we like to build and we like to create. Our nature is to create. Now, sometimes, by virtue of the power of that creation, destruction has to come in and balance it back out. So therefore, when we create marvelous things, we also end up inadvertently creating things that eventually hurt us. And so therefore, the same type of technological advancement that gave us the ability to travel to the moon and maybe even go beyond that to Mars and who knows where else, unfortunately produces the technology that allows us to create nuclear weapons that can literally destroy the entire civilization. And that's necessary for the balance of it. That's built into the way the universe works. There's an old thing with the deists who are always trying to figure out, is God present? Maybe God exists, but it seems like he's like a watchmaker God, where he sort of spawns creation into existence and then sort of sets it up and then takes off and never to be seen or heard from again, and then just leaves the universe ticking itself away. It's automatic now. It's all on automation. And to a certain extent, creation is completely automatic. It was spawned into existence, and it has a certain definitive threshold of operation, at which point it will extinguish itself. And that is natural and normal. It only can keep that system going by maintaining balance. And that balance requires a certain destructive element. And so in Hinduism, we call it, they have a trinity that's very different from the Christian trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In Hinduism, they have Brahma, who's the creator god, Shiva, the destroyer, and then they have Vishnu, who is the sustainer, sort of the in-between, sort of keeps things keeps the process cohesive so that neither force Brahma throws at the universe or any force that Shiva throws at the universe, throws it out of balance. And so evil spawns, or what we perceive to be evil, spawns from that destructive principle. So from that vantage point, to answer that question, yes, ultimately speaking, at an absolute level, what we call evil was created by God, but it is not part of the creation, so it wasn't actually created. It is a natural consequence to creation. So when you create something, there has to be a counter principle. Otherwise, it will not spawn into existence. I can illustrate this with photography. Anybody who's ever studied photography or even has Photoshop on their computer can understand this. When you take a picture, and particularly in black and white, usually there's a need to adjust the contrast. it's especially important when you're developing film. I used to develop film in college, and so you really get to see it when you're doing it that way. These days, cameras kind of automatically set up your picture so that there's very little that you need to do as the photographer. But if you really want to have a really nice picture in black and white, you kind of usually have to adjust this contrast. If I apply too much contrast, then the picture goes black and I can't see it. Try it. Upload a picture into Photoshop and go to the contrast settings and change your contrast to the highest rate that you can, and eventually the picture is going to go black. You won't see it. Likewise, if you put too little contrast, the picture is going to go too bright, too white, and it will wash it out and you won't see it. The only way you can see the picture is by having a perfect balance between the dark aspects of contrast and the light aspects of contrast. And so when we are understanding the way existence works, which in order to exist, you must have contrast. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to distinguish one thing from the other. I would not be able to have an understanding of the difference between you and me, Rodney, if we did not have contrast. There's got to be some distinctiveness that can be observed. Otherwise, if the distinctiveness did not exist, then there would be nothing to distinguish who we are from each other or whether or not we're the same thing. And ultimately, on some level, we are actually the same thing. It's just, we are just instruments of observation. We are one giant instrument of observation. And because we have enclosed pockets of observation sensory systems, we feel like they're our own. So we feel like our body is separate from this person's body, that person's body. But in reality, it's the same observation system. The observation that you're able to perform in your mind is the same observational systems that I perform in mine. It's just it feels like it's coming from my mind because I'm a closed sensory system and you're a closed sensory system. We're not physically attached in any way, so we don't really experience that aspect of the universe as being the same, even though it is. We see it as different. So your thoughts feel like your thoughts, my thoughts feel like my thoughts, and we think that because we can't hear each other's thoughts because the sensory systems are not connected, we think that it's coming from a different source. Your thoughts come from your brain, my thoughts come from my brain, when in reality it's the same thought coming from the highest principle of awareness, which is intrinsic to the entire universe and permeates through all aspects of the cosmos. So I know I'm getting a little bit ethereal, but the fact of the matter is, don't look at evil as who created it. Look at evil as the side effect of the process of creation. It is a necessary aspect that must exist, and it becomes bastardized by human behavior. So therefore, we're not just content to allow the natural process of destruction to occur within the universe. Sometimes we take it upon ourselves to initiate it ourselves for personal advantage. So the way we interpret it is, okay, well, here's this person who's this horrible sociopath, and maybe he likes controlling people, so maybe he rapes women and molests children, and he does all these things that we would classify within our mores as being reprehensible evil behavior. And for all intents and purposes, at the level of human existence, it is pure evil, because that's not conducive to our obligation to creation, which is to actually promote creation, not destroy it, not harm it in any way. And by committing murder, by committing rape, by hurting children, we are actually harming the natural process of creation. We're inhibiting it. We are taking parts of that creation and making it dysfunctional, because we know that rape and murder and child molestation and all of the great evils that human beings commit actually create long-lasting dysfunctional behaviors that perpetuate. Children that have been abused, grow up and sometimes become abusers themselves. Sometimes they go into these long depressions and they never get out of them. And so there's dysfunction there. And so strong ones can sometimes rise above it, but overall, you're putting that individual at risk. And that's evil to us because it's not compatible with the creative purpose that we vibrate with. We were designed by, and I hate to use the word design because then it sounds like I am making it too theological, and I don't want to make it too theological. I want people to understand it not just on a theological level, but also on a philosophical, metaphysical, and physical level, which would include science. It has to work in through the process of balance. And so we should, as human beings, allow the process to unfold naturally, which is sometimes going to involve unfortunate death. That's just the way it works. And you might say, that's not fair, that's not good. Why did God take this person away from me? I love that person, And it's not like that. It's just part of the natural process, and it feels bad to us because we grow attached, and we were never really supposed to form attachments beyond their functions. But because we create stories, we start to obsess over those stories, and the stories become more important than the function. So I don't know if that's going to really be a satisfying answer for your querent there, but that's a very difficult question to answer because it doesn't have a clear-cut answer.
Right.
Well, I thought it was a fascinating answer.
Yeah.
The next question is, what is your opinion on free will?
Free will is a good one. I like this one. And, there's this old debate with the Calvinists as to whether or not predestination is the rule or free will, and the answer to that is that it's actually a little bit of both. But it's not as significant. Free will is not as significant as we think it is. And let me try to explain this one. There are certain things that God did predestine and literally wrote into the process of creation itself. So one of those things is the process of salvation for Christian members of your audience. They'll understand it this way. There is a certain process of God's will that cannot be changed. For example, there is nothing that could have stopped the crucifixion. There is nothing. There's nothing human beings could have done that would have prevented the crucifixion from happening or could have changed it. It was established, God's will, impossible to change, immutable on every philosophical, theological level. It was necessary to occur. It was established as what it was, and there's no changing it. So any action of free will could have never altered that process. There are other things that happen in the timeline between the beginning of creation, which science calls the Big Bang, to the end of creation, which most scientists now are starting to say would be cold death. There's different theories as to what's going to cause the end of the universe. So some people think it's going to be the Big Crunch. I tend to be one that adopts the cold death theory, but I think it has more evidence metaphysically, so I tend to gravitate more towards that theory. But overall, in the space in between, there is what I call an evolutionary directive that is established and cannot be altered. That's God's will. We want to, as human beings, as part of the creation, want to align ourselves as close to God's will as possible. And so our free will determines how closely aligned to that evolutionary directive that God set into motion that we can call God's will is. And so we can make decisions that are not compatible with God's will, which won't change God's will, but will actually create great havoc for ourselves and those people that it affects. It doesn't change the end game. It doesn't change the ultimate result, but it does create a great misfortune for the people who are affected by those unskillful actions. Likewise, for people who do align themselves to God's will by cultivating a proper application of human free will, by aligning with God's will, are able to produce great benefits to the people that are around them. So the choices we make in life are not significant to the end game. They're not significant to the ultimate functioning of the universe. The universe will continue on, I assure you, even if we take every nuclear bomb in this world and completely eradicate the Earth, the universe is going to be just fine. It will keep going on without us. And that is perfectly within the framework of the creative process of the universe. And I hate to say it, but there are other civilizations out there. It's not just us. The creation is unthinkably massive. The cosmos is beyond comprehension in terms of size. And so we're not the only intelligent civilization that exists within this cosmos. It is statistically impossible as far as I'm concerned. But again, that's another subject. But the point of the matter that I'm trying to get at is our free will only to decide how closely we want to align ourselves with God's will. But we don't change anything. That's important. We can only change the course of our own experiences. And our experiences are not important. Like we talked about before, we create stories. The reality, or I should say the actuality is everything is function. But from human perspective, it feels like we have this purpose and that function, and we find meaning in this, and we create these little stories for ourselves. Think about it. When you go out to dinner you meet new people, and what's usually some of the first questions people ask you? Well, what do you do? Oh, I'm a doctor. I'm a bishop. I'm whatever you want to. I'm a talk show host. We define ourselves by the things that we do, because we really don't have a whole lot of substance left to define ourselves. I mean, what else can you say? Well, I'm a humanoid, Homo sapien. What's that? Okay, well, I'm a male. You might be able to add that as a descriptor. But the reality is, that doesn't tell you much about the individual's behavior, which is what we want to know because we like the story. And behavior is how we write the story. And those stories are not important to God, really, not at the ultimate level. They are at the level of salvation, which is a different thing, and that's where we have to get into the theology and understand our relationship to God, which is more of the traditional understanding of the church and how it relates to God. But what I'm giving you here is sort of extending outside of that regular paradigm, going a lot further than that paradigm, so that you can understand how this works a little better from God's vantage point. It's not perfectly God's vantage point, but it's a little bit closer to how he sees the situation rather than how we see it. And so from his vantage point, there's nothing that we can do to change it. So our free will doesn't really have any impact on his will. The only difference is we can actually be conducive to the creative process by aligning ourselves to his will through our own choices that we make and by effectuating skillful behavior, or we can fall away from God's will and make selfish choices or harmful decisions. In the end, God's will is still done, but our experience is going to be vastly different. We can have a smooth sailing ride, or we can have a hellish ride. We can make the planet Earth a utopian Star Trek-like society in a few hundred years, or we could have a post-apocalyptic, miserable, hellish existence. It's our choice. In the end, God's will is still done. The process that he put into place through what we call creation is not affected by any decision we make. So to answer the question, free will and predestination, it's a little bit of both.
Okay. So how can a Christian take the Bible word for word when it has been rewritten many times to suit man's agenda?
Well, one of the things that they can do is to utilize a version I should say a translation of the Bible that at the very least, goes back to the earliest manuscripts that we know exist. So you want to utilize a version that is close, that in the scholarship of the translation had at its disposal the earliest manuscripts that we have available. That's going to cut down on a lot of the nonsense that came with some of these more modern translations that are truly inferior. So that's number one. That's a simple thing to do. The second thing is to understand that the Bible is not a history. It wasn't written to be a history. It contains historical data points, but that wasn't its function. These are faith accounts. These were written as experiences that certain men had with God, and they wanted to share those experiences in a way that human beings could understand through stories, so that they could learn how they could themselves have a similar experience with God. So it was never meant to be this literal historical record that if you don't follow it to the letter, then there's no hope for you. That was never its intention. It was never put together with that intention. In fact, the canon that we currently have, that is the established Bible, was not really formulated until hundreds of years after it was all written down. And the reason for that is that the early Christians did not have any real need for a canon. There were different regions that had different books, and some of them didn't make it into the final canonical Bible. And then there were some that did. But each region had certain books that were written down and certain regional preferences that were utilized, and it contained certain information that community felt was important, and so they would read those things at their gatherings, their services that they had in the ancient primitive church. And Christians got by just fine doing it that way. It was never taken literal. It was always about what was your experience. So when you read the Gospel according to John or the Gospel according to Matthew, what you should be doing is not looking at it in the vantage point of saying, oh, this is the history that I must follow and adhere to perfectly. What you should be doing is saying, this is Matthew and John and Mark and Luke sharing with me their experience with the divine, how they connected with it. And maybe through their sharing, I can gain something for myself that I can use so that I too can have an experience with the divine like they did. And if you utilize that formula, you will get there. You will have a God. That's what our tradition, the Nicolean Catholic Church, exists to teach. That's the teaching side. Everybody's always interested in the exorcism ministry, but that's our outreach, and that's because there's a lot of people out there that have a lot of spiritual problems. But we do have this very important and unfortunately somewhat marginalized teaching side, where we teach people how to have a direct experience with God for themselves by helping them to break down the paradigms that limit them. And one of those paradigms, unfortunately, is biblical literalism. You can't have it. It's going to break you eventually. Either you will become a blind adherent and you end up worshiping the Bible instead of God, which most of these Bible literalists are. As Christian fundamentalists fall into this category, and I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone, but it's true. Their worship is about their perception of God and has nothing to do with the authenticity of God. But what we try to focus on in the Nicolean tradition, and I'm not trying to say we're better than anybody else, but it's just what we do, is we focus on the experiential side of this. So we utilize the scriptures as a guideline, as a guidepost for understanding the formula that worked for these ancient people. And we read about what they had to say, what their experiences were, how it worked for them. And then we take that information and then we apply it to ourselves in a way that opens up for us the divine life. Not limits it, but opens it up so that we can move beyond those limitations. Faith was never supposed to be the end point. Unfortunately, that's what it turned into in modern Christianity. So today, when you ask, a typical American Christian, what is the highest virtue in their Christian existence, they're going to tell you faith. But faith should be the starting point. It shouldn't be the end. And unfortunately, for Bible literalists, it's the beginning and the end. So it's sort of like they stay within this perpetual spiritual kindergarten and never evolve to a point where they can actually take on some of the divine responsibility themselves. In order to do that, you have to move beyond Bible literalism. You never move beyond the Bible, because the Bible is always going to be the best information we have about the story of salvation, at least for the Christian. But that doesn't mean that we're supposed to take all of that content and say, well, here's a contradiction here, and here's a historical inaccuracy here, and this scribe added this verse here. Bart Ehrman wrote numerous books about the inconsistencies of the Bible. I actually enjoy his lectures. I have many of them on recording, and I enjoy Bart Ehrman greatly. But one of the obvious flaws to his methodology is that it doesn't matter if there's contradiction in the Bible. It wasn't supposed to ever be written as a documented history. It was written as a faith account. It's poetry. It's metaphor. It's art. It's supposed to convey a higher archetypal resonance. It's not supposed to connect with our linear objective reality. It's supposed to rise us above that, so we're no longer limited by linear thinking. And so the scriptures are supposed to be read as a means to evolve, not a means to de-evolve, which is unfortunately what is happening today. And that is one of the greatest crimes committed in Christianity is Bible literalism. It was never designed that way, and it actually limits its purpose to the point that it almost makes Scripture irrelevant. So I am very sympathetic when a person is born into a Christian denomination that unfortunately operates that way and loses their faith and loses their complete connection to the religion and becomes an agnostic or atheist. I'm very sympathetic. I fully understand that, because honestly, if I had been given those experiences, I might likely have become the same thing too. And that's because literalism is never going to help you to actually use the Bible for what it was designed for. It's supposed to help us rise above so that we can understand the archetypes that work within the process of salvation, allows us to connect to those archetypes so that we can align ourselves to those and attain to it. You won't get there through literalism. You'll only get there through application of the wisdom that it contains, that is hidden beneath, or I should say between the verses. Who cares what John 3:16 says? What matters is what is between John 3:16 and 3:17. That's what matters. That's where you should be looking. The space in between.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So what happens to the souls after death that have never been introduced to God or Jesus or any type of religion?
Well, that's an interesting one, unfortunately, it's kind of a dark reality, and not for the reasons people think. What's less important is the tradition that you follow. What's more important is the mastery that you attain through the cultivation of your awareness by utilization of the tradition that you choose to follow. So I personally think that there are two religions in the world that are superior to all the others. And that, I would say, is I would put Christianity and Vajrayana Buddhism at the highest peak of the spectrum of spiritual mastery. Because both of them contain archetypal systems in their theological structures, in their philosophical structures, that align us to the very archetypes that cultivate the awareness that is necessary to attain to salvation. So I put them in the highest rank. Then I would put Hinduism as a very, very close second. And then further down the line, we would, start to see some of the other manifestations of religion that are not as perfectly aligned to the archetypes of salvation as Buddhism and Christianity are. So understanding that, let's say we have an individual that has never been exposed to any of that stuff. Although in today's world, you're going to be hard-pressed to find that. But it does happen because you're going to have people who are mentally deficient. Maybe they have some type of compromised intellect in some way, and they're not able to understand the intellectual pursuit of philosophy and religion. And so they never really fully grasp, like a person who has maybe a traumatic brain injury from birth. They're never going to have the intellectual capacity to gain spiritual mastery. It's not going to happen. Likewise, you're going to have people who reject spirituality just because it does not resonate with them. Maybe they're just too much a left brain, scientific, objective thinker, and they're not able to operate at that archetypal level where these higher spiritual processes exist. And so therefore they never connect with them. So those are our two examples. Someone who is intellectually deficient by virtue of an injury or a birth defect, and somebody who is maybe intellectually incapable. They got a strong mind, but they're not able to, because of the way that they're wired, they're not able to connect with things that are not objective realities, like the things that they can use with or observe through their five senses. Kind of what we talked about in the first question. So what happens to them after they die? Well, there are only a few options. And the church kind of gives us, again, within the story of its theology, a metaphor to work with. And the metaphor is actually quite good in this context. And so you have salvation, we call that heaven. Hell is not what people think it is. Even if you really read very closely in the theology of the New Testament, hell is not a place of eternal torment and punishment. There's metaphors that were used to make people frightened of the place, which became, or I should say place, I should say condition. It's not a place. Hell and heaven are not places. They're conditions. But hell, in the Middle Ages, really through Dante's Inferno and medieval superstition and superstitious thinking that was, rampant in the Middle Ages because, let's face it, civilization fell apart to the Dark Ages. People sort of degenerated for a while. Civilization in the West degenerated for a while, constantly being invaded by the barbarians. It took its toll on people's knowledge. And so a lot of the true theological wisdom was preserved only in the monasteries. And the average person, did not have the wealth or status to be able to educate themselves. So they never really understood what these things were. So they saw the world, they saw their religion superstitiously. And so hell went from annihilation to a place of permanent torture and punishment. And that's not the hell of the original Gospels, okay? Jesus refers to hell as the fires of Gehenna. Gehenna, by most biblical historians, is largely believed to have been a trash dump outside of the walls of Jerusalem, where the residents of Jerusalem would bring their trash to be destroyed. It was sort of like an outside incinerator. And so the idea here is, again, one of annihilation, not one of punishment. You don't punish your trash. You don't torture your trash. You burn it. You get rid of it because it's no longer useful. Trash is trash because it's not useful. And then we further see that in his parable of the weeds and the wheat, where Jesus gives us the parable of, the guy, the person who comes and says, there's all these weeds growing amongst our wheat. Should we uproot the weeds so that that they don't cause problems to the plant? And the master of the field says, no, because if we uproot the weeds, we'll take some good wheat with it. So let's wait until harvest time, where we'll harvest everything, and then we will separate the weeds from the wheat. We'll take the wheat and we will store it in a bin where it can be utilized for food, and then the weeds we will burn in the fire. Again, not to punishment, but to get rid of them, because they are what? They're not useful. And so the whole concept of heaven and hell is not so much about reward and punishment as what we got as a carryover from the primitive, superstitious thinking of the Middle Ages, but rather is the result of skillful action and usefulness, cosmic usefulness, and unskillful action and cosmic unusefulness. And so anything that does not ultimately work towards the purpose of creation that is set up within the evolutionary directive that we call as Christians God's will is eventually thrown out. Not because God wants to get rid of it, but simply because it's not useful. It's not conducive to the purpose of creation, and therefore it needs to go. And so we call that condition hell. We call salvation heaven, because that is those systems of skillfulness are so useful to the process of creation that it is retained, it is preserved, it is saved. So when we talk about Christian salvation, it's not about being saved from punishment or death. It's about literally being saved like a file on the computer. It's like something that is so useful that you put it away in a safe place so that nothing happens to it. Like a valuable, like a diamond ring, it doesn't get lost or stolen. You're not putting it in there to save it from annihilation. You're putting it in there to protect it because it is so valuable to you. And so those are the two ultimate conditions. Either we get preserved or we don't. But there is this decaying process in between. And there is a purification process in between. And so we call that in modern Catholic theology purgatory and limbo. Purgatory would be the final state of purification, or in this case, the final state of skillfulness. Limbo would be the slow process of spiritual decomposition that eventually leads to eradication. That would ultimately, we would call it hell in the Christian context. It is also important to note that in Jesus' time, hell, which was referred to in Hebrew as Sheol and in Greek as Hades, was also not a place of punishment or torment. It was a place of semi-consciousness, almost like mostly a place of virtual unconsciousness, where you would just go into this state of perpetual sleep to the point that you just sort of drift into nothingness over time. And that is ultimately what the church now calls limbo. And so for a person who is not skillful enough or unskillful enough to do either any good or any harm, they will eventually just pass into a condition of limbo unless they are given exceptional graces by virtue of the prayers of the church, where they can be made skillful by proxy. And this is something that was completely lost after the Reformation, because prior to the Reformation, Jews have always prayed for the dead, at least the ancient Jews did, and then Christians always prayed for the dead up until the Reformation, where the theology changed and the focus was moved away from purgatory. And part of that was because Martin Luther was so much against the selling of indulgences, which is very much related to purgatory, that he didn't want anything to do with purgatory or limbo anymore. And so he just sort of whitewashed it completely out of the theology. But the fact of the matter is, for the first 1,500 years of Christianity, the church saw it as its primary obligation, which was to pray for the dead. Why? Because we can give some of our grace, our skillfulness to them and help to preserve them and make them skillful by proxy. And so that would be considered to be part of the condition of purgatory. So a person who is like our first two unfortunate souls, the guy who's too scientific to spend his time believing in God, and the person who's just unfortunately too intellectually inept through brain injury, through birth defect, or whatever. They will drift into, upon death, the first thing that happens is obviously the body begins its process of decomposition. We start with rigor mortis, and then it just, the bacteria eventually just takes over, and the natural process of decomposition occurs. The spirit, which is the non-corporeal part of the human body, which contains raw awareness but no consciousness. Consciousness is part of the brain. The brain is part of the physical body. So consciousness and rationality cease to operate upon death. All that's left is instinct, and instinctual awareness in the form of the non-corporeal spirit. And that takes a much longer period of time to decompose, but it does begin its process of decomposition very soon after the death of the body. And that condition of decomposition is what we call limbo. And that will continue for an extended period of time because at this point, non-corporeal things exist outside of linear time. They're no longer bound by, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. They're more just a state of existence and non-existence. It's just, either you're here or you're not. Time no longer has any meaning. And so from our vantage point, it looks like it can take a very long period of time for that to, and the energy is very strong because there is a great deal of instinctual energy in that spirit. We call that a ghost. And if it's really strong, concentrated, we would call that a haunting. And that's what spawns these things. What it is mostly limbo. It's in limbo, and I say in quotation marks because, again, it's not a place, it's a condition. Purgatory, on the other hand, is those that have done enough work to have preserved enough of their process that they are cohesive enough to hold themselves together, but haven't perfected their skillfulness enough to actually become vibrationally compatible with heaven. And so therefore, that condition gives them certain abilities to perfect their state so that what the church calls purification, what it essentially is it's burning off the unskillful aspects and improving the skillful aspects to the point that they eventually are able to raise their vibration to a point that becomes compatible, and then they enter into the kingdom of heaven. And we can help that process along by virtue of giving them some of our skillfulness through grace. And that's part of the praying for the dead thing that has an archetypal resonance. And again, that's a subject for another show that I can explain how that works, but that's another thing that's very involved. So let's go back once again to our two unfortunate candidates. The guy that can't wrap his head around God, and so is an atheist, and then the person who's just not intellectually capable of understanding anything. If they just die and nobody does anything for them, they will immediately begin that physical decomposition. Then the spiritual decomposition process kicks in, and eventually, over time, they will dissipate. And then when they have completely been eradicated and reabsorbed into the destructive process of the cosmos that we talked about in some of the other questions, that energy gets recycled and respawned. Buddhists call that reincarnation. Of course, it's not really reincarnation because the entity that is respawned from the energy of the old person is not the same person. It's just their energy. So it's kind of like if when you go to sleep at night with your wife and you're under the blankets on a cold night, you're sharing each other's warmth. So she is sort of taking some of your heat. So let's say you went into bed an hour before she did. She gets to go into a nice warm bed, and she's using your energy to feel warm. And that energy that you gave off is there. And the same thing goes for reincarnation. It's not really the respawning of a person. It's simply the realization of the energy that previous person once had. And that's what happens to those unfortunate people. They just get recycled, indiscriminately recycled. But if we can offer our prayers for them and give them some of our own skillfulness, assuming we have enough skillfulness of ourselves to give, which is why religious praxis is so important, because that skillfulness can not only be used for ourselves, but to share with others who are not as capable as we are, then we can take them from that condition of limbo and raise them to that condition of what we call purgatory. And then eventually they will, over the process, enter into the state of skillfulness that we call heaven. But if they are not preserved, then eventually eradication will take over, and there won't be any shred of their vibration left. And then that's when we would call that going to hell. Not punishment, just eradication. And that's kind of the answer to the question.
Okay. Okay. So exactly what was before God? That's what I don't understand. Where did God come from?
There is nothing before God, because the very nature of existence is God itself. And existence is not, it has never not been. As soon as existence occurs, existence has always been. Kind of like a way of understanding this would be sort of like understanding why in Christian theology the devil is irredeemable. People sometimes will ask me, if Satan repented, if Satan went to Jesus and said, you know what, I was wrong. I should have never done all these things. I'm sorry. I want salvation. Would Jesus be able to save the devil? Or would the devil's repentance be able to save himself? And the answer to that is it's an impossibility, because angels, by virtue of their nature, exist outside of time. And if you exist outside of time, you would occupy all points in time at the same time. There would be no yesterday, today, or tomorrow. There would be no past, present, or future. There would simply be now, at all points, at all places in space and time. And so if an angel makes a decision, just as God making a decision, it's an eternal decision, as it would be for you. If you were to exist outside of space and time, and you made a decision, that decision would not only always be, it would have always been. That's a paradox that the human brain has a hard time wrapping itself around. But to answer, to really understand where God came from, you need to get a piece of paper. And if you've got one, get a pen and get a piece of paper, and I want you to write down the sentence below is true. And then after you do that, write beneath it, the sentence above is false. And what you're going to get is a classic paradox that is both statements are completely true, and both statements are completely false. They are hopelessly irreconcilable. And the existence of God is the same way. It is a paradoxical condition of having always been and never having been at all. God is existence, non-existence, and the space in between both.
Wow.
Boom.
Oh,
That's just a mind blow, wasn't it?
I know. I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. Well, what about, is Jesus really God? Are they two of the same, or are they separate?
Well, yes, I would say from the Christian theological worldview, absolutely, God is 100% God and 100% man. He is he is considered to be the mediator between God and man, because he is the only he is the only being or only condition that actually possesses both realities in one. And so, yes, he is absolutely God in that sense. But from another standpoint, you can see Jesus, and this is, I know I get a little philosophical, and I kind of go off on these deep esoteric tangents, and some more traditional Christians would be uncomfortable with some of the places that I go, and that's okay because I understand that. Some of this material is not for everybody, and some of these things are things that are not shared typically outside of the cloisters of the most contemplative, Catholic monasteries in the world or Orthodox monasteries. It's just not shared. But it is definitely things that are discussed behind that cloister and just usually reserved for theologians and high-ranking clergy because, they're the ones that have studied it enough to really, not get themselves too far lost in it. But I like to share it because I think it's important, and I think we're reaching a point in the evolution of our civilization where we're ready to start, understanding things at a higher level, because if we don't, we're going to lose people. And we are. The church is losing people because it no longer speaks to them. And the reason it doesn't speak to them is because people no longer understand what the use of it is. And so part of understanding its usefulness is going back to the esoteric tradition that spawned it in the first place. And that's why I teach these things, even though some people are uncomfortable with it and some people think I probably shouldn't. But getting back to the question, when we are looking at the nature of God, okay, we have to always consider that our experience with the divine is always going to happen symbolically. We call that in psychology, we call the symbology or this world of symbology archetypes. Carl Jung was the first one to really talk about them, although Freud, started a rudimentary understanding of archetypes. But really, essentially, what they are is they are symbols. I like to refer to them as the alphabet of the language of God, a way of being able to speak with God, communicate with God in a direct way, in a tangible way, in a way that both God and man can understand each other. And so to understand Jesus, whether you're a Christian or not, you have to understand him archetypally first. So on an archetypal level, what he represents is the symbiosis, the truly symbiotic union of God and man in Christian theology. If it was through the manhood of Adam that the world fell, and we fell from the state of grace, we fell from our connection to that state of perfection that existed before the events of the Garden of Eden, which is, again, a metaphorical theological story. It's not meant to be historical and literal. Then what Jesus is the new Adam. So Adam, the Old Testament Adam, is who we became by not accident, but by disobedience to the will of God. But by obedience to the will of God, we become aligned to Jesus. So what Jesus represents is the corrected man, a perfected man. And that is who we must align ourselves to in order to become like him. And so Christians would call that holiness. But what holiness really is archetypal alignment. And we have no archetype for the ultimate reality of God because we can't even conceive of that. So what Jesus gives us is a human archetypal symbol that we can align ourselves to so that we can engage in this divine reality until we have risen above it to a point that we can start to understand these ineffable things. And at that point, you have to kind of leave behind human intellect and our brain power, because those things are always going to be limited to linear corporeal existence. We have to move to a state where we become less corporeal, and we are becoming less corporeal. as time goes on. That is going to be our ultimate condition, which is sort of alluded to in his transfiguration, the story of the transfiguration in the Gospels, and also the resurrected body, which we hear in the stories of the Gospels, that the resurrected body of Jesus was sort of physical and sort of not. You could touch him. Thomas was able to put his fingers through the nail marks in his hands, but Jesus could also pass through walls, and Jesus could sometimes appear as people that they didn't even recognize. They didn't even know it was him. So the resurrected body is very different from the one that we currently possess. But it is also a promise of Christian theology that if we do persevere in the Christian faith, we will also resurrect like he did. And we will enjoy a resurrected body that is completely identical to his. So the perfected man is also going to be a whole lot less corporeal. But that's just sort of a long and complicated way of answering your question. But yes, whether you want to slice Jesus down as purely an archetypal myth, or whether you want to see him as a historical Christian reality, as I do, he is God either way, and the historicity of Jesus is not as important as the archetype that he represents on both sides of that equation.
Okay. Well, what is your opinion about, all the wars that are and have been caused in the name of God or religion?
Well, that is some of the unfortunate unskillfulness, that when you give people power, when you give a limited species like we are, who is not fully developed, we're half-baked. In fact, we're not even half-baked. On the evolutionary scale, we're, I would say, not even probably 5 or 10% done. And so when you're giving what is literally little more than a species of monkeys with sophisticated brains, the power to kill, the power to control, the power to engage with God, which is what religion is, then you're also giving a very inept species the power to make a lot of mistakes. And so I tend to rank religion in the same category as hammers, automobiles, and guns. They're all wonderful tools. An automobile can get you from Georgia all the way to California. You can go from East Coast to West Coast in about 3 or 4 days. All right? And you might even, if you drive through the night, you can get there even faster. It's a wonderful marvel of human innovation and a wonderfully powerful tool. You can take a hammer and you can build a wonderful house with it. Well, you can also take that hammer and crash someone's skull in and kill him. There's a skillful use for the hammer. There's an unskillful use for the hammer. You can take that car, drive from coast to coast, see some new places, go on vacation, have a great time. Or you can commit vehicular homicide and run over a whole bunch of people like these morons out there in ISIS and, that seem to be their new chosen form of terrorism. The truck isn't evil. The truck isn't evil. The hammer's not evil. Yeah, but the people using it can be skillful or unskillful with it. Same thing with guns. I'm not a huge let's go out there and fill our arsenal kind of guy, but I believe very strongly in the freedom of gun ownership. And the reason for that is that I don't see guns as evil. I see the people who use them inappropriately as evil. They're the ones that are committing the unskillful actions. The gun does not get up, walk around, and shoot people arbitrarily. It's people who do that. I can also take a gun and I can go out and feed my family with it by hunting. I can protect my family from an intruder with it. Those are skillful applications. Religion is no different. Religion can be used for great, skillful spiritual application, or you can take it and you can bastardize it down to a political control system that is used to influence nations and destroy civilization. And it certainly has been used that way. Why? Because the human species is nearly not even 10% finished. We are largely stupid still. We are monkeys with brains. That's it. We're still monkeys. We've never really left we are primates. I mean, after all, and our reptilian, the primitive part of our brain is all instinctual. It's all animal anyway. And so, that's incidentally why the archetypal form of the devil is animal-like. Why he has horns and a tail like an animal does, because the devil archetypally represents that animal nature that exists within us, that is largely that largely explains why we do or why we commit horrible atrocities. And so it doesn't make the gun bad, it doesn't make the hammer bad, it doesn't make the truck bad, it doesn't make religion bad. We can use these are just powerful tools. We can use them skillfully, which is what we are here to learn to do, or we can use them unskillfully, and we can screw everything up. In the end, guess what? The cosmos goes on without us. It got by just fine without us for billions of years, and it will get by for billions more years without us if we destroy ourselves. We're not as important as we think we are, but God wants to make us important. That's what salvation is all about. It's about making an insignificant species significant. And that is, again, getting back to that original question about how egotistical God is. It's the most selfless thing that a God could do. It's to take an insignificant species like us and actually spend time with us to the point that he can make us significant if we apply ourselves. I mean, what a wonderful gift that we are completely undeserving of, because it would be a lot easier for God to just annihilate us. Let's face it, we're more trouble than we're worth. And we use his gifts against him and each other. And religion is one of the greatest gifts we were given. And yet there's no tool in the human arsenal, powerful tools, more destructive than it. And that's because we use it badly and we don't know how to use it correctly.
Mm. Well, what exactly does it mean that the Pope is infallible?
Papal infallibility is a tough thing. That's a more recent invention of the Catholic Church, to be honest, about the late 1800s, where it was declared as doctrine. Prior to that, it was sort of loosely understood, but it was never a formal doctrine. What it means is when he speaks ex cathedra from the chair and makes a de fide statement, okay, what it means is when he does that, his statement will be perfectly aligned to the Holy Spirit and will be infallible from error. It will contain no error by virtue of it. But it's only when he speaks ex cathedra, which is almost never. In fact, Pope John Paul II was once asked about it, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something to the effect of, only a fool would ever speak ex cathedra, because he never felt that a man ever really had, even the Pope, even really had the wherewithal to ever make an infallible statement. But what it is, at least in theory, on a theological level, if the Pope speaks ex cathedra, it is, by the teaching of the Catholic Church, said to be free of error, free of doctrinal error. So it means that there would be nothing that a Pope could say that would be contrary to the faith of the Church as it was given to us through the relationship of the Holy Spirit. But of course, nobody but Catholics accept this doctrine, and I should say nobody but Roman Catholics accept this doctrine, because the very schism that created the independent movement that I became a part of started by the old Roman Catholic Church that originally became schismatic because they would never accept the doctrine of papal infallibility. That was one of the major points that caused the schism in the first place. So old Roman Catholics don't accept papal infallibility. If you were to ask what my personal opinion is on it, I don't really care. It's just not. It doesn't affect me either way. If the Pope wants to make a statement and consider it ex cathedra, I'm good with that. I'm cool with that. His canons don't affect mine, so it's kind of a moot point. But I don't discount it any more than I accept it. I just, I find that a lot of Catholics find a lot of value in having that doctrine, so let them have it. But I don't think it's a terribly important doctrine to the Christian faith.
Well, Bishop, we're just about out of time, and my gosh, wow, what amazing answers! And to be honest with you, you're going to be a regular on this show, I see. If you're
I would
okay
love
with
to.
that,
I'm sure we haven't gotten through half the questions.
Actually, no. But we'll stop tonight for there, and we'll try to get you back on in a couple, 2 or 3 months when you're available, and we'll pick up from where we left off, if that's all right with you.
That is perfectly fine. Save those questions, and anytime you'd like to have me on again, just let me know, and I will definitely make time for you and your show.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. Oh, and real quick, if anybody's got any questions or comments they want to direct straightly to you, how can they get in contact with you?
Well, the best way probably would be to go through the website for my church, which is esotericcatholic.org. That's esotericcatholic.org, or you can go there through Nicolean.org. It's NICHOLEAN.org. And then there is a contact us link there. You can click on that. It shows you how to get in touch with us. It has the phone number for the church and the email address. You can also, if you have Facebook, you can go to find us at the Nicolean Catholic Church, the Holy Nicolean Catholic Church on Facebook. Just do a search for it, and it will come up with our page. Follow us there, and there is an option there for asking direct questions or leaving comments, that type of thing. And I or somebody from my staff try to get to everyone. Not always as quick as I'd like to, depending upon how many come in, but typically speaking, we do handle every, or at least answer every single contact that is posed to us. So those are 2 ways to reach me that are fairly simple.
Okay. Well, Bishop, I do appreciate you taking the time and enlightening us. And like I said, I have an odd feeling you're going to be a regular guest on if you're up to it.
I would very much like that. I would like that.
Okay, sir. Well, you have a good night, and there again, I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much. God bless.
Much.
Thank you, Robin. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Everybody needs to understand that I'm more than simply a hype man for this rap group, just like Geico is more than just a company that can save you money. Geico also has fast and friendly claim service, so they can help you when you need it most. And while I do love being a hype man, I also love reading for children's audiobooks. Like Little Bo Peep, she lost the sheep, and she don't know where to find them. Yo!
Geico. Expect great savings and a whole lot more.
And now, insurance-minded speeches from Geico.
It's a common expression, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. However, what if the horse's mouth is filled with useful insurance tools? This is the exact case with the Geico app. Yes, the app is free and therefore a gift horse. However, look inside the app and behold, emergency roadside assistance, digital ID cards, bill pay. Get the Geico app. Look it in the mouth, get amazing services. Thank you.